strategy they could ever want available to them, even the illegal ones. But even if they all fail, even if employers really throw everything at the wall and nothing sticks and the union vote is successful, management still has a trick up their sleeve. They wait you out. Once the union wins, all companies have to do to stay on top is not sign a contract. Because if a year goes by after a union election without a contract being signed between the union and the company can start trying to get the union decertified, and then it's back to square one. It is an understatement to say that the system is rigged against workers. The truth is that it couldn't be more inhospitable to labor organizing. I mean, even the self-proclaimed most pro-labor president in American history is a goddamn strikebreaker. Power is not on the workers' side.
True.
And that's why it's so encouraging to see how successful workers' movements are at the moment. The deck is stacked so heavily against workers, and yet the public is on their side and they're winning. Battle after battle. We're seeing people, for the first time in a while, collectively beating the odds, learning from their experience, and using that knowledge to help one another have a better life. The ball is already rolling. So if you watched this video and you'd like to try to unionize your workplace, there has never been a better time in recent history to do it. To help, I've put links to the IWW's website in the description. Not only does the IWW have plenty of resources for you to read, you can use their site to get in touch with experts who can help you unionize your workplace, fight back against the dirty tricks your employer will use, and win. And if you're not employed, or if your job is already unionized, you can still help others with this process by handing out pamphlets or other information in the stores you visit. Just be subtle about it. You don't want to get the employees in trouble. People always ask every week about what they can do to help, how we as individual workers can make a difference. Unionization, even just educating yourself and your coworkers about building labor power, is one of the most critical ways we can fight back against an oppressive capitalist system. We're at the very beginning of a new labor movement, and we need everyone to get involved, fight back, and build a better future for all of us. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this episode is made possible by GiveWell. When you give to charity, how much impact will your donation actually have? This question can be hard, if not impossible, to answer. Most charities can't tell you how your money will be used or how much good it will accomplish. If you actually want to help people living in poverty with evidence-backed, high-impact charities, I highly recommend you check out GiveWell. GiveWell spends over 40,000 hours each year researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact, evidence-backed opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. And using GiveWell's research is free. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. They publish all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. No sign-up required. They allocate your tax-deductible donation to the charity or fund you choose without taking a cut. I personally give to the Malaria Consortium. My wife is from Zimbabwe, and her family has seen firsthand how devastating malaria can be. The Malaria Consortium is incredibly cost-effective. It only costs about $7 to protect a child from the disease. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube and enter Second Thought at checkout. Make sure that they know that you heard about GiveWell from Second Thought to get your donation matched. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen.
Next one.
Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
If you're a homeowner in Washington and you're still paying for electricity, then I've got some big news for you.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. We just did a major overhaul of our patrons-only Discord server, so if you'd like to join our growing community and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. Remember when these videos started with rhetorical if statements? Me neither. Anyway, if you ever looked at a screen during 2020, you probably saw this image. It's the Black Lives Matter mural in DC. And like many other things I start my videos with, I'll probably be talking about something else in like 30 seconds. For now, though, I want to talk about this mural, because it's one of the most obvious political stunts in recent years. Commissioned in June of 2020 by Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, the Black Lives Matter mural accomplished two things. It made Apple Maps briefly relevant again, and it set me on the path of writing a 20-ish minute video about political recuperation and Gramscian hegemony 2 years later. Other than that,
there's a lot
not
I could
so
do right
much.
now.
Well, sorry, it
I just
did
don't
do
know
one more
how
thing.
to
For
handle
Mayor
it.
Bowser, the mural was a very effective way to co-opt and neutralize Black Lives Matter without hearing any of the movement's demands, and actually giving herself the freedom to move in the complete opposite direction. I can't believe I almost forgot to mention that. Because at around the same time the mural went up, Bowser's proposals for 2021 included increasing police budgets and doubling the size of the cadet program. That is, when she wasn't busy spending time on TV proposing her, let's say, creative interpretation of what defund the police really means. You're gonna laugh, but I clearly misunderstood what defund the police meant the first time around. Oh man, I am embarrassed. Of course, the DC wing of BLM was quick to point out Bowser's hypocrisy and call the mural out for what it is, a pointless stunt. And they're right, but it's also a lot more than that. This mural fits into the more general topic of political recuperation and the idea of governing through consent. Let's do a video about that. Because the truth is that symbols like the mural and more generally quote-unquote culture matter a lot in politics. Even though I had a lot of fun being a cheeky little guy and saying the mural didn't achieve anything, I only said that because, well, I wanted you to like me. And because I meant that it didn't help achieve the goals of the BLM movement in any way. In fact, it actively hid the betrayal of the movement's demands entirely. But it still mattered a lot as a cultural symbol, because ultimately, it was an integral part of the liberal co-optation of the Black Lives Matter movement and its watering down to a vague demand for recognition. It allowed Democrats like Bowser to remain as legitimate political figures in the public eye without actually representing the more radical wing of their electorate or carrying out its demands. In that sense, the mural did actually achieve quite a lot. In politics, this kind of co-opting and watering down of radical ideas is sometimes called recuperation. Okay, really it's only called that by this guy, Guy Debord, badass smoker and French philosopher of the mid-20th century. Who is this nerd? Well, he wrote a book, so now here we are. In his book, The Society of the Spectacle, and in the Manifesto for the Situationist International, which he also wrote, Guy launches what academics call an attack, and what everybody else calls a couple paragraphs of words, on what he considers the new era of capitalism. Capitalism 2, Consumerist Boogaloo. Following World War II, Guy became concerned with how his native France adopted consumerist culture, a society in which the solution to all the ills of modern life are channeled through the acquiring of mass-produced commodities. Guy described how, in the search for ever-growing markets, a society in which basic needs were generally met for most people turned to the consumption of not really necessary stuff. Buying not really necessary stuff became a new fundamental economic need, but also a basic human need. In a consumerist world, market actors and advertisements are no longer trying to convince you to want the hip new FM radio. They are telling you that you need it, in the same way that you need food on the table. In short, ads create new needs. Beyond this incredibly simplistic description of what advertising tries to do, however, Guy explains that it's not an actual belief in the need to own the latest piece of tech that motivates us to buy it. It's a need for the way these commodities make us look. In other words, appearances become essential to consumption, and by extension, to all of social life. It's all about appearances. Everything becomes about the spectacle. You need stuff not because you actually need it to live, nor do you need it because you're tricked into thinking you need it to live, but because you need to keep up appearances. It looks good to have stuff, and the specific stuff you have says something about you that you want others to know. Alright, big deal. So far we haven't really gone any further than your boomer dad talking about how dumb ripped jeans are. But for Guy, those jeans really do matter, because not only are they, like other consumer products, capable of making us feel really bad, reduced to our appearances, and alienated from ourselves, but the philosophy of appearances that this image-based consumption cultivates ends up becoming a huge part of our society, and therefore, of our politics. For Guy, then, politics become dominated by how appearances are manipulated without substance ever really needing to support them. Today, the classic example of this is Donald Trump and how he convinced some 60 million people that a billionaire real estate mogul was somehow not part of the elite. He played on his appearance as an outsider to hide the reality of another political elite who would spend his time in office growing the power of his wealthy buddies with things like tax cuts for the rich. But even if he's the most egregious example of what Guy calls the spectacle in politics, the same framework of analysis applies to Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who both challenged Trump mainly by cultivating their own image, that of responsible, level-headed politicians, instead of any meaningful contradiction to his policies, many of which still haven't been reversed since Biden took office. The same goes for every other politician, even the ones you like, and the same goes for every late-night show host who spent every minute of a 4-year term on how dumb Trump's hair looked, or his daily outrageous tweet, far more often than on the policies he carried through Congress. This is what Guy calls the society of the spectacle, in which appearances take on this disproportionate influence and can come to replace the substance of material reality in many cases. But believe it or not, we haven't even gotten to the good part yet. We haven't talked about revolution.
Dude, this is a horrible gaming experience. How do you live like this?
Well, I don't know, Linus. I don't have time to research upgrades for this thing.
Because there's more to politics than politicians trying to get you to vote for them. There's also a bunch of people in power who benefit from the society of the spectacle and use it to make sure their power doesn't get wrestled away from them. When the dominant class is confronted with radical, subversive, or revolutionary opposition, movements like Black Lives Matter, for example, using the power of appearances comes in really, really handy. That is recuperation. The ability for members of the dominant class to twist and appropriate revolutionary appearances for their own benefit, absorbing revolutionary sentiments into their fold and ensuring their survival as the dominant class doesn't get challenged because they've neutered the radical content that those images used to communicate. In Guy's own words, the ruling ideology sees to it that subversive discoveries are trivialized and sterilized, after which they can be safely spectacularized. In the case of DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, her appropriation of the Black Lives Matter or Defund the Police slogans does exactly this and helps her achieve two things. One, it sterilizes the message. Defund the police is no longer about actually defunding the police, silly. It's about reform, more training, and more money. Black Lives Matter is no longer about actually ensuring the value of Black lives is respected by distributing wealth more equally, abolishing the violent carceral state and the militarized police, or ensuring that the institutions that guarantee a decent life are properly funded everywhere. Black Lives Matter is just about saying that Black lives matter, and that's it. It's literally just about the spectacle. But that's not all. The second thing this appropriation does is it provides a safeguard to her power and the power she defends, that of a white supremacist nation that can only function with a heavily racialized distribution of property. Now that the radicality of the words Black Lives Matter and Defund the Police have been completely neutralized, Bowser can use them all she wants. And because she said the words, painted them on the street, and paid lip service to the movement, she can somewhat credibly position herself on the side of the revolutionaries while firmly maintaining the oppressive status quo they are revolting against, effectively killing the subversive movement. It's nothing more than a rhetorical trick. Guy Debord would say Black Lives Matter has been recuperated. This whole approach to government isn't entirely new. Decades before Guy was born, another political theorist had figured out that culture was a major part of the ways governments and dominant classes self-preserve and govern. That guy is Antonio Gramsci, and he had an idea he called hegemony. For Gramsci, a leftist Italian revolutionary imprisoned under Mussolini, governments and dominant groups maintain their status in two big ways. There's the obvious one, the way governments have always run the show, violent coercion. Your armed forces, your police officers, your prisons, and all the laws and regulations that establish and enforce the rules of government above you. That's the obvious way that those in power stay in power. Nothing very surprising there. Gramsci's innovation, which has honestly lost a lot of flair after like 90 years, is that violent kind of coercion is only being used to discipline people who don't consent to the way society is organized and to the rule of the powerful. The problem, for those in power, is that if too many people don't consent, and your only solution is beating up those people, you run the risk of starting a revolution. And then there are gonna be way too many people to beat up, and you might lose your beaten stick. So dominant classes don't just repress those who don't consent. They also use the domain of culture, what Gramsci calls civil society, to manufacture consent in the general population and suppress more subtly the kinds of thinking that may upset their interests. Media and political institutions, the vast majority of which are less accountable to the general population than to the financial interests that fund them, can serve as the means by which this consent is manufactured. It's not usually going to be done with outright lies, but with more subtle biases that frame stories a certain, at times dishonest way, or focus on one issue while ignoring another, or transform the debate or change the language with which it is understood, or make it about something else, or platform some people and not others. Ultimately, however that consent is manufactured, the main goal will be to present one narrative as dominant and most easily agreed with, and its contradiction, which could threaten established power, as disagreeable. The upshot, if you're one of these people in power, is that the more people speak in your terms and agree with the basic premises that keep you in power, the less you'll have to repress them with guns and barred windows.
I don't think I've ever
To
had
be
that.
clear, all forms of media will have
music disc.
bias. There is no such thing as absolute neutrality in media, as I constantly tell people in the comments. The difference with manufacturing consent is that the assumptions that communicate bias aren't framed explicitly as such. They're presented as if they were common sense, or at least they're never explicitly challenged. The result is that that kind of bias can become almost imperceptible to a general audience when these unchallenged, mostly hidden biases are repeated across the entire landscape of the media we consume and in civil society more generally. This is cultural hegemony, the absolute and incredibly subtle domination of culture by one group. Guy called this the rigged arena of official culture, and Gramsci's analysis uncovered its relevance and maintenance by the upper class, the state, and their institutions. Nowadays, it's not hard to see the constant debate of the phrase defund the police, three words which could not be easier to understand, participating in this muddying of the water and pacification of a more radical idea. This form of government, that operates through cultural institutions, sanctioned political debates, and the recuperation of subversive politics, can have incredibly powerful consequences. Not only does it maintain the kinds of oppressive power structures that we all know and love from your classic capitalist society in the short term, it can create what another nerd calls capitalist realism. This is the last nerd, I promise.
The war in Ukraine forced my family to flee. My sister, mother, and grandmother left their entire lives behind on February 24 and moved in with my family in America. They are very fortunate, while more than 10 million other Ukrainians are left without electricity, heat, and water, including my dad and my disabled grandmother. This war has done incredible damage, but the surprising temperatures are about to make things much worse. I don't want to see more of my family and friends suffer, so I'm asking for your help. If you're still watching this, I think it's because you care.
According to Mark Fisher, yet another political theorist, capitalist realism is the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Capitalism becomes common sense. Here again, according to Fisher, the interests of businesses, which are usually framed as the interest of the economy, are so dominant in our culture that we come to accept truly horrible realities as inevitable and uniquely real. While the neoliberal era has produced endless suffering around the world, the possibility of global human annihilation by climate change, and countless wars and conflicts for profit, billions of people still justify the integrity of the global capitalist economy because it has become incredibly difficult to imagine an alternative. Hey, it might be horrible, but it's the best we've got. At least that's how we've come to rationalize it. And for that, we have to thank, at least in part, the persistent efforts of recuperation that have hollowed out even the most revolutionary of movements and made them agreeable to the persistence of a capitalist economy. In the neoliberal present, the only solutions that are considered valid and enter the public debate are those which merely mitigate what capitalist societies portray as externalities of economic production. The problems of a capitalist society aren't really problems with capitalism itself, of course, just its execution. They're externalities, unintended consequences, nothing more. We're led to believe we can really fix these issues without challenging the overall economic order. But many of these issues are so intimately tied to the pillars that uphold capitalism that they won't go away without those pillars crumbling too. Under the logic of capitalist realism, there is no abolishing capitalism or even considering that as an option when trying to solve its problems. The only legitimate way to quote-unquote solve climate change, for example, is staying squarely within market logic, buying eco-friendly things, or watching your individual carbon footprint, or creating new carbon markets to try to gamify pollution. It's not that an economy that needs to grow endlessly forever and constantly deliver at least 3% gains to shareholders will inevitably extract more from the earth to produce more to sell more. It's just that you're not buying enough paper straws. Save the turtles, you selfish jerk. Under the logic of capitalist realism, entire alternative economic models are cast aside as utopian, as jokes, as impossible. You'll hear things like, how can you really defend communism? Don't you know every time someone tried it, it failed? But don't pay attention to all of its successes or the ways capitalist societies are failing you right now. Those we can actually fix. This economic model is different. It can actually achieve all that utopian stuff. The fact that it's dominated the global economy for centuries and these issues have only gotten worse doesn't mean anything. Trust me. Part of the tremendous power of capitalist realism is that it can exist side by side with the empty symbols that promote its abolition. Endlessly co-opted movements for liberation become watered down until they're just prefixes or qualifiers for various parts of the capitalist economy. The way you'll often hear about green capitalism, rainbow capitalism, or black capitalism. Media like Squid Game, or Parasite, or Don't Look Up become that week's water cooler talk. Movements and phrases like Black Lives Matter may have become a fixture of our modern society, but in many ways it's because they've lost a lot of their radicality. Not because they've been truly accepted or achieved any of their goals, but because they've successfully been defanged by an advanced system of recuperation to not really matter or be perceived as an actual threat to the social order they challenged. I recognize that this video, like most of the videos on this channel, is kind of doing the same thing. My job is taking some pretty radical ideas and turning them into entertainment for you, turning them into something that you can pretty passively consume. Sadly, these videos, just like most everything else, are part of the spectacle too. We've never met, we're not actually communicating, and even if I think I'm doing a pretty good job, which I do of course, I'm very full of myself, trust me, even if I think I'm doing a good job, I am still mostly talking ideas at you, not with you, and without an immediate or concrete plan in mind. As essential as I think what I'm doing is, I'm just one guy on the internet, and I hope that you will fill in the gaps and carry what you learn in these videos into the real world to actually improve things. Fight for change and make it reality. Otherwise, what's the point? Let's give it a shot. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. As you can probably imagine, when I made the switch to producing political content, I started getting demonetized way more often, and most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, but because of this, I'm having to rely more heavily on viewers like you. If you like the kind of videos I'm producing, and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. We actually just dropped a major update to the Discord, and there are some really cool new features. We've got everything. This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. About 600,000 people experience homelessness in the US. Think about your own life. You might not be homeless, or necessarily even know someone who is or has been. But you certainly know someone paying too much for rent, someone having trouble finding a place to live, someone facing eviction. In other words, someone who could become homeless without much needing to go wrong. More and more Americans are joining this category every day. The truth is that in 95% of US counties, those who work a full-time minimum wage job cannot afford even a one-bedroom apartment.
Change that to a 2-bedroom, and the entire country becomes unaffordable. This situation is only getting worse. As a result of the pandemic, rising housing costs, wage stagnation, and the inadequate policies of our local and federal governments, the number of people experiencing homelessness and of people on the brink has been steadily growing for the past decade. That is, if you only look at the US. In this episode, we're looking at Finland's approach to homelessness, what Housing First is, and what it could mean for the American economy. In Finland, only about 5,000 people, 0.1% of the population, are homeless. And that's even with the broadest definition of what constitutes homelessness, which includes more than who you typically think of when you hear the term. The Finnish definition of homelessness goes beyond just those who are living on the street or in emergency accommodations like shelters. In some cities, like the country's capital Helsinki, no one sleeps on the street. That type of homelessness has been completely eliminated. Compare that to the US's nearly 600,000 homeless people, which is almost exclusively so-called rough sleepers, those who live on the street, and the problem starts to become apparent. What's more important, though, is that homelessness isn't just low in Finland, it's actively going down. Between 2010 and 2018, Finland enjoyed a massive 40% decline in the homelessness rate. If it sounds like we're cherry-picking data, even during the pandemic, which, let me remind you, has caused a massive surge of homelessness in the US, homelessness in Finland did not increase. So what happened? How is Finland so effectively reducing homelessness? In 2007, the Finnish government started a national Housing First program. Housing First is a philosophy that argues that to make progress on homelessness, particularly chronic homelessness, you need more than temporary emergency solutions. You need permanent housing right out the gate. In other words, housing is the starting point, not the end point. The way Housing First programs work is pretty simple. People experiencing homelessness receive independent housing immediately, without having to first fulfill mental health, sobriety, income, employment, or other requirements. Once they're housed, support services are offered, not imposed, and over time, the newly housed begin to finance part of the cost of their housing to the degree that they can afford it. It sounds pretty intuitive, but this is very different from the more common continuum of care or staircase approach we're mostly using. In continuum of care programs, homeless people are expected to make progress on any mental health or addiction issues they may have, and to pass a certain standard before being housed. In this system, housing is at the top of the staircase. These individual changes that these programs require are the sorts of things that are incredibly difficult to address when you are still contending with the anxiety of not having a home, possibly still sleeping on the street. In these continuum of care programs, only once you have demonstrated some change, which we should keep in mind is incredibly difficult to achieve without housing stability, do these programs graduate you into housing arrangements. First shared housing, and slowly over time independent housing. To some, continuum of care approaches sound great. That is, in theory. They map onto our society's values of meritocracy, of security. Only those who are deserving get access to the prize of having a home. Under this mentality, if you don't have a home, it must be because you're just not good enough yet. Come back later. It should be obvious that these programs just don't work. Not only do they strip people of their agency and come with an enormous moral burden, but recidivism is high, and a huge number of people don't make it into the program in the first place because of the high barrier to entry. Compare that to Housing First. In the initial study on Housing First, back in 2003, a randomized trial of the two approaches decidedly shows the strength of the new program. Around half of the initially homeless group were accepted into permanent housing, regardless of their eligibility according to other programs, and they were then offered tailored and optional care for their individual circumstances. The other half went through conventional channels, and at the end of the trial, the results were clear. The Housing First group spent more time in stable housing, less time hospitalized, and results carried over for longer than when homeless people went through the continuum of care path. Within just 6 months, Housing First had virtually eliminated homelessness in the experimental group. It was a massive success. That first study was in New York, and inspired by its promising results, the EU ran its own pilot programs in 5 European countries with the same outcome: secure, long-term housing stability. And now that it's become the official national policy of the Finnish government, we've seen just how much good this can achieve. It is abundantly clear that this approach works. Despite all of this, some of you might still be skeptical. Forget for a second that housing is a universal right we are all entitled to, that it is baked into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US has signed onto and agreed to provide in front of the entire international community. Forget that this right doesn't include temporary shelters, but only real, stable housing, and that there are metrics around accessibility, affordability, discrimination, and protection from eviction which good Housing First programs conform to perfectly, in addition to affirming the basic idea of being decent to real human people. You might still wonder about costs in the wealthiest country in the world that regularly provides housing subsidies mostly to the wealthiest people in the country through mortgage interest tax deductions costing the American people, I don't know, $70 billion a year, or close to 25 times what is set aside for homelessness programs at the federal level. Imagine all that incredibly important stuff doesn't matter. It's gone. Forget about it. Housing First is still cheaper than not housing people or walking them through an ineffective continuum of care program. Not only are people housed through Housing First covering part of the cost and are more easily employed, but housing people saves money in the long term on comparatively costly emergency hospitalization bills and absurdly expensive policing, which both go down when 1. People's needs are taken care of preventatively, and 2. They aren't exposed to an expensive state apparatus that has criminalized existing without a house.
You love your stuff, because your stuff is amazing. But what if bad stuff happens to...
Given all this evidence, you're probably wondering, why aren't we doing this? To be fair, there are some small-scale examples of this in the US. The US Department of Housing and Urban Development does fund certain homelessness programs, some of them with the Housing First methods. However, these programs are only robust in a few cities and states. But no matter the nature of the program, whether it's Housing First, Continuum of Care, or something else, funding is far too low. The HUD's budget and municipal aid funds have steadily declined over time, and as a result, programs scrape together a budget from the general public and several different local and federal funds, rarely ever amounting to what they actually need to provide effective services. But the main problem behind all of this isn't that homelessness programs aren't getting enough funding. That is an issue just a little further down the line. The underlying problem is affordable housing, and at the core of that problem is our capitalist organization of the economy. Under a capitalist economy, housing isn't treated like the right it's considered to be by most nations, including, on paper, the United States. Instead, it's a commodity, something to be traded, speculated on, turned for a profit. That is the main goal of housing in a commodity market. Not putting people in homes, making money. As a result, developers, investors, and the like don't focus their energy on housing the poor, from whom they can only extract so much, but rather on building luxury accommodations for the wealthy, leaving largely empty units across the country only rarely occupied, if at all, while people in desperate need of housing are refused access and subjected to a manufactured housing scarcity. On top of that, there is a very real incentive for capitalists to only partially resolve homelessness. The threat of losing the roof over your head keeps even the most exploited worker in a job they hate. Increasingly, that threat forces people into even more dire conditions as wages become less and less sufficient to cover housing costs, forcing people to take on several jobs and work untenable hours to avoid the possibility of eviction. It is not in the capitalist interest to remove that powerful, terrifying incentive. And here is where the Finnish success story may go beyond Housing First alone. Not only is Housing First doing a good job of taking people out of homelessness in a reliable way, but a social democratic organizing of the economy is limiting the extent to which people are likely to fall into it in the first place. It's still capitalism, so it still relies on somebody being exploited, in this case people in the global south, but at the very least, social democracy goes part of the way on neutering perverse capitalist incentives on continuing homelessness domestically. One key element of this is unionization. High unionization at 75% of the Finnish workforce, and therefore higher wages and higher job security than in freer markets, mean that as people exit homelessness, they are unlikely to be replaced or fall back into it themselves. American conservatives love to rail against Housing First, touting its failures to make significant changes in cities like Los Angeles, where homelessness has continued to rise despite Housing First programs taking root. What they conveniently forget to mention is that the continuum of care programs they prefer still deliver worse results. And the core issue of the skyrocketing housing prices in the free market is why people are even pushed out into homelessness in the first place. The thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. There are solutions to reduce the scale of this issue. Earlier this year, the Gravel Institute released a great video on one of these solutions, the decommodification of housing. I'll put a link to that video and all of the sources for this one in the description. At the end of the day, the conclusion that you should take away from the Finnish case isn't just that this one type of program works really well at taking people out of an incredibly difficult situation for the benefit of everyone. It does do that, but that's not the point. The Finnish example gives us a glimpse of how we can treat housing differently. Instead of being a game for the wealthy to gamble their own fortunes and the livelihoods of millions of Americans, Housing First shows us what housing really is: a necessity, a right. It's something that must come before almost everything else, something which we must guarantee, or fail to recognize the humanity of millions of people. If you're interested in what the future of housing might look like, I highly recommend you check out Home of the Future on CuriosityStream. It's a fascinating look at cutting-edge production methods and radically different approaches to housing than those we see today. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As you probably know, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well. That's why some of my YouTuber friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream, so we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since you're already on the internet watching my video, why not spend some time learning about fascinating topics on CuriosityStream? Or check out Nebula's original content, including my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism. You can also watch all my videos as they were intended, ad-free. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Ooh, which one's next?
Here's the deal with SEO on Wix. You get a site.
This episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support my channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. This is a video about why Uber and the whole gig economy sucks, and also about how more and more jobs are getting gigified. Since this topic's been floating around in the background for 10 years now, let's start with something recent.
72% of drivers in the US are saying that one of the considerations of their signing up to drive on Uber was actually inflation. Life is getting more expensive. They need to pay extra for their groceries. So on the supply side, we may be actually benefiting from the inflationary environment.
I want to dig into
the clip I just played is a delicious little treat. In this clip, Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi is on CNBC doing a big oopsie and openly admitting that his company benefits from people having less money. In this case, because of inflation. He's a happy little guy because people are flocking to drive for Uber out of desperation. And that means he gets to tell investors the line is going up this quarter. Just look at that smile. I could honestly end the video here, because nothing I can say will ever top a tech CEO transparently describing how he plans to make money off an economic crisis, pushing thousands of Americans closer to food insecurity, and then smiling. But I am a glutton for watch time, so onward with the rest of the video. That clip is only the tip of the iceberg. Uber, and the economic model it's come to represent, is about a lot more than profiteering off inflation and sudden explosions in poverty. You might have heard the term Uberization before, or platform capitalism, or simply the gig economy. Apps like Uber, Lyft, Grubhub, TaskRabbit, Fiverr, and all the other Uber but for blank apps have unleashed onto society a supposedly new and disruptive economic model. Its advocates, and these apps themselves, describe the gig economy as a whole new way to work, a whole new society, reimagined from the ground up with futuristic technology at its core, and in which an unprecedented number of people will get the freedom to set their own hours, work from anywhere, be their own boss, and if they work hard, rake in big bucks. But of course, rather unsurprisingly, this is all BS. Every part of it, including the idea that any of this is new. Let's first start with the money thing, specifically drivers' wages, because it's a good entry point into understanding not only what this economic model really is, but also why it's become such a staple. Figuring out how much Uber drivers, or any other gig workers, make is a headache for everyone, including gig workers themselves. Inconsistent hours, demand, supply, tips, surge pricing, app policies, location, driver data-based algorithms, and so on mean that there is no normal situation from which to extrapolate a universal estimate, despite there being years of data at this point. There's no one number that really tells the whole story, and the question, how much does an Uber driver make, unfortunately doesn't have a single answer. Nonetheless, two things are certain. One, it's a lot less than they should be, and two, Uber lies and inflates its numbers, by a lot. Back in 2014, for example, Uber used to say that the median salary of its New York drivers was $90K a year. A pretty good sum, more than the city's average salary and way above minimum wage. With this number that the company was very proud of, Uber was telling potential drivers that it could offer a salary on par with a job that requires a college degree, but with the only barrier to entry being owning a car. If this sounds too good to be true, it's because it is. It didn't take long for reporters to look into it, and driving for Uber full-time absolutely does not end with $90K in workers' pockets. In reality, reporters estimated that New York's Uber drivers made around $12 an hour, or about $25,000 a year full-time. In other words, under the poverty line for a family of four. And astute observers will have recognized that $25K is, believe it or not, actually a lot less than $90K. Admittedly though, this is just one calculation made pretty anecdotally. More recently, it's been estimated that Uber drivers' earnings are even lower, around $350 a month on average, and $155 at the median. These numbers are, again, hard to truly understand, because they lump together full-time, part-time, and occasional drivers. And while these numbers can give us a general idea of what's going on, they're still nothing specific. Luckily, you don't need specific numbers to understand the problem with Uber and other gig economy employers. Uber drivers, like almost all gig economy workers, are technically considered by the company as independent contractors. As such, Uber drivers do not get basic things like a minimum wage, health insurance, paid time off, sick days, overtime pay, or any other benefits associated with salaried employment. Every moment that you are not working is money out of your pocket, meaning that those for whom the app is the sole means of revenue have incentives to spend as much of the 100 maximum hours the app allows you to work per week doing just that. This also means that any major injury or sickness or any sudden life event puts drivers and other gig workers in a very precarious position. Uber's entire model leads to overworking and exhaustion, measures that Uber hardly combats with driving caps that still allow most waking hours to be working hours. Reports of drivers sleeping in cars and doing incredibly long stints are not only common, but can be exacerbated by the ability to switch between apps to avoid automatic cutoffs. The kind of move that makes sense when a 40-hour work week isn't enough to avoid literal poverty. And, unsurprisingly, Uber benefits tremendously from this arrangement. The freedom to set your own hours discourse has pretty successfully shielded the company from all sorts of criticisms about these kinds of consequences that are very much intentional. Any worker dissatisfied with their earnings, or the amount of work they're doing to earn a meager wage, can be told to simply work harder or smarter. Supposedly, you have the freedom to work as much or as little as you like. So if you aren't happy, you can just adjust those variables. Never mind that what the law is meant to guarantee for someone punching in 40 hours isn't applicable. But there's more to it. Thanks to, let's call it the legal optimization strategy of considering drivers independent contractors, all the costs associated with providing Uber's service, getting people from point A to point B in a car, are completely shouldered by drivers themselves. Whether that's buying the car or renting it, paying for the maintenance and the cleaning, paying for insurance, self-employment taxes, income taxes, healthcare, and most importantly, gas, these are all on the driver's dime. Drivers are responsible for all these payments that can take a pretty good gross income, like the one Uber likes to show off, and turn it into a poverty line net salary very quickly. Normally, a company would handle most of these costs and need to provide at least a minimum wage. But thanks to this legal loophole, Uber doesn't. This is what makes the company stand out, and makes it so attractive to investors. For years, in order to make this horrible deal legally viable, Uber has made every effort to portray itself as a simple middleman. Just an app, nothing more. A sort of service that drivers pay for with a cut of their sales, but by no means an employer. Something Uber loves to remind its drivers with the use of the phrase, "be your own boss." Uber justifies this by saying that it doesn't set its drivers' hours, like a normal business would, nor does it force its drivers to take rides, the way a salaried employee might be given tasks to accomplish as part of their work. But of course, these are superficial details considering the enormous amount of control Uber still has on its drivers. Using data collected from every ride, every driver, and every rider, Uber toggles variables like price, number of rides, and other important things that drivers are not privy to and cannot negotiate within a range of variability much greater than would ever be normal for an independent contractor. This means that although Uber might not formally work like a traditional employer, the algorithms and policies it has in place effectively give it as much control over its drivers as if it did. Uber can quite suddenly turn the tap off, cut its drivers' earnings, and blame the whole thing on fluctuating demand or the algorithm. But in most places, the law doesn't consider this amount of power over work to be traditional employment. So Uber can keep circumventing labor laws, including some very important ones.
Hey, the people at Discovery Channel came to me and asked me to do the impossible. Go undercover and show...
In many countries around the world, independent contractors have practically no guarantees, as we've already covered with minimum wage and healthcare being off the table. But more sinister, and less well known, is that in plenty of countries, independent contractors cannot form unions. In the US, under the National Labor Relations Act, for example, only employees are guaranteed this right, meaning that any form of collective bargaining that could raise workers' wages, set more reasonable limits on driving hours, or in any way improve the experience that drivers have with the company is off limits. And now that the public and the state have caught on, gig economy companies are making sure that this extremely lucrative loophole won't disappear. Back in 2020, for example, Uber and Lyft spent $200 million to stop California from classifying Uber drivers as employees. And in 2016, Uber and Lyft lobbyists outnumbered Amazon, Microsoft, and Walmart combined. This lobbying powerhouse means that Uber can't fail, even when it does. Recently, for example, the UK formally reclassified Uber drivers as employees, but Uber still held onto its strategy and therefore its profits by ensuring that things like minimum wage guarantees would only apply when drivers had a passenger in the car, something which the app is only able to do 40 to 50% of the time, meaning the minimum wage guarantee is effectively slashed in half. Drivers spend almost half their time on the clock waiting through no fault of their own, but get punished for it, all thanks to Uber's powerful lobbies in yet another perfect example of how pushing the independent contractor story doesn't line up with the traditional employment reality. Clearly, spending all that time waiting conflicts with the whole setting your own hours guarantee an independent contractor should normally be actually guaranteed. Then there's the fact that even if Uber says it's an app for free independent contractors, or people working a couple extra hours as a side hustle, Uber is completely dependent on the people who treat driving for the app as a full-time job to survive. And it proves as much with all its efforts to actively seek them out. Uber would simply not work without functional employees. And as proof, in 2021, the company set aside $250 million for a so-called driver stimulus, desperately trying to attract full-time drivers from its pool of part-time workers. This is because, according to data from the city of Seattle, 1/3 of Uber's drivers, those that work full-time, provide up to half of all rides. Uber simply couldn't survive without people treating it like a full-time, normal job. But the company can't ever admit this fact without risking labor laws killing their whole business model. In practice, this means that all Uber has done is turn back the clock and called it innovation. It has popularized a model that produces full-time employment without the legal protections earned through decades of militant labor struggles, like the 8-hour workday, the weekend, Social Security, and so on. It has taken us back to a time where companies hold all the cards, with no exceptions and no governmental regulations to prevent them from pursuing ever more destructive labor policies. And while Uber may not be profitable, despite its now 13-year-long existence, investors continue putting money in and holding their shares because they recognize that this model, with its ability to slash employment costs, is the best chance they have at profitability in the long run. And what's terrible is how little this actually has to do with Uber. The rest of our economy has completely bought in. Today, 70% of Ryanair's pilots are independent contractors, airplane pilots. And if that doesn't seem crazy enough, several companies are now trying to do the same thing in the healthcare industry, pushing nurses into that same independent contractor status and saving hospitals money. That is, saving hospitals money not by nationalizing healthcare, or preventing insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies from profiting off of people's basic need to continue living and being healthy, or any other sensible measure, but by gutting workers' paychecks. And it's not just a matter of a few examples here and there. Today, 53% of people aged 18 to 24 who work in the gig economy do so as their primary income source. And according to a Princeton study, 94% of the net employment growth in the US between 2005 and 2015 has been in quote-unquote alternative work arrangements, meaning independent contractors, temp work, and freelancing are basically the only new jobs our economy is producing. While we tend to think of companies like Uber and Lyft as the main perpetrators of this shift in work, they actually represent a very small piece of the pie. As little as 0.5% of workers according to that same study. The sad truth is that regulating a few apps won't be enough. Our entire economy now depends on the blatant exploitation of a legal loophole that allows conventional companies to hire conventional employees, call them something else, and get away with a bigger cut of the profit. And although companies like Uber have made their name by blatantly breaking the law and entering markets where protections for workers would have kept them out, in some cases, the transition to precarious gig work has been welcomed by our governments. The Uber files, a leak from earlier this year, revealed that then Minister of the Economy, now President Macron, negotiated with Uber representatives to get the company in France, screwing over established taxi drivers and bringing in a new service that would outcompete them by being more affordable thanks to Uber's own subsidies, and of course the company's reliance on a more exploitative and damaging contract with its employees. Confronted with this leak, Macron has even doubled down, stating he would quote, do it again tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. The picture that's emerged from the past few years presents a very grim vision for the future. The trend of precarious work that is poorly paid, unprotected, and maximally exploitative will obviously continue. Governments, beholden to the profit motive and the private interest that lobby them, will continue accommodating this exploitation, happily rolling back the gains of organized labor when they get in the way. Without intense organizing efforts, the future, and frankly the present, is not bright. For decades, people have been told that if they are poor, if they are miserable, that they should just work harder, make money by selling their time and energy to someone who will profit from their exhaustion more than they themselves ever will. It was always a raw deal. But now that even a full week's worth of work isn't enough, that companies gloat when inflation pushes people into more dire poverty, and that our governments welcome these changes with open arms, what could there possibly be left to support? Our labor landscape needs a complete overhaul, and we're not going to get it with politics as usual. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. As I've expressed many times before, YouTube doesn't treat socialist creators very well. Because of this, I rely on viewers like you to maintain my channel. If you like the kind of videos I'm producing and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. We have everything from a recommended reading list, to a book club, to special channels for our neurodivergent and LGBT comrades. I also try to do a live Q&A once a month, which is always a good time. We've built a great little community, and we'd love for you to be a part of it. So if you'd like to help support my channel, join the Discord, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
What next? Let's see.
This is an opinion you can...
You can watch how capitalism ruined work. Sounds like
Want a second income stream? Because if you can download an app from the App Store, then you can now build a
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. If you're unemployed, it isn't because there's no work. There is, and always will be, work to be done. What we don't always have is jobs. Let's back up a little bit. In this episode, we're looking at a uniquely capitalist failure: meaningless jobs and the unemployed masses. We'll unpack both of these phenomena and the different elements of a capitalist economy that shape our relationship to work. Every economic system to date has had its problems. Only under capitalism, however, has finding meaningful and useful work been an issue. It is a uniquely modern problem for an economy to be structured so that hundreds of thousands of people are without a meaningful job, and at the same time, hundreds of thousands have their most basic human needs going unmet. Our modern society is the only one in which people are both going without food and shelter, and it is actively disincentivized to organize things in a way that would help them. All of us can look around at our communities, our cities, our country, and see that there are things that need to be done, that there are issues we can all agree upon and want to see resolved. But we all know that there is only so much we can do as individuals. Whether it's because we work long hours and need time to rest, because we're unemployed and need to actively look for a job, or because we're in a precarious situation ourselves, most of us have barely enough time and energy, if any at all, to feed the hungry, house the homeless, or generally better our lives and those of the people around us. Many of us work jobs that feel completely devoid of meaning, that seem to help no one, and we still can't spend our time in more meaningful ways because we too need a steady wage to keep a roof over our head and food on our table. We are trapped, and it seems nearly impossible to get out. In the midst of all this, finding a decent job has become incredibly difficult. Long gone are the days of walking into a bank, asking to see the manager, and starting at a desk the same day. Industrial jobs have steadily declined for decades, and even the relative security of a college education has waned as more graduates go into low-wage or even unpaid entry-level jobs. There is little hope that this generation will achieve the financial stability of our parents. And for those who entered the job market at the height of the pandemic particularly, employment has been lagging far behind expected levels. So, how did we get here? 3 different elements of capitalist society play into our current relationship with work: the profit motive, capitalism's purposeful misallocation of labor, and the crises that are built into the system's proper function. Let's start with the profit motive. At the heart of our current crisis is the fact that the profit motive, the feature that capitalists have told us makes capitalism so efficient, does a terrible job at properly allocating for human needs. Capitalists frame it like this: if you are incentivized to make profits, and the only way you can do that is by providing something that somebody else needs, a service or a product, self-interest will naturally transform into common good. Reality, however, turns out very differently. Not only can profit be generated in entirely speculative ways that don't benefit anybody, think cryptocurrency traders, but in just about every sector of the economy, the profit motive does more to pervert the common good than enhance it. In the pursuit of higher profits, companies will destroy brand new items, purposely build flaws into their products so they'll become obsolete faster, or throw away perfectly good food. As a direct result of the profit motive, our planet is increasingly polluted and we live progressively more wasteful lives. But the market of goods isn't the only place capitalism's incentives don't work in our favor. When work enters into the equation, we see the same thing happen. The endless search for profits leads people at the very top of our society to make far more than they could ever need or spend. At the bottom forms a vast chasm of crushing poverty, and it all starts at hiring. In the hiring process, the profit motive consistently leads the managerial class to offer lower wages, worse benefits, longer hours, and more dangerous working conditions to potential employees so that they can be the tiniest bit more profitable and gain a sliver of an edge over the competition. Workers face a similar dilemma, offering to be paid the minimum they can afford if it means they can guarantee getting a salary over the next person. Thanks to the profit motive, it is in the interest of the company to hire the fewest people, give them the least amount of money, and work them as much as possible to extract every last penny the competition isn't extracting themselves. But at the same time, the profit motive leads companies to offer jobs that are increasingly meaningless, but very profitable to shareholders. We'll get to that in a second. But first, let's look at the flip side of the coin, unemployment. While the profit motive can explain part of the equation, our lack of jobs is explained by another feature of the capitalist economy. For a capitalist system to function, it is absolutely essential for some people to be unemployed. This is called the natural rate of unemployment, and it is one of the foundational elements of our 21st century stage of capitalism. For companies to consistently push wages down in a capitalist economy, thereby increasing their profits, staying competitive, and retaining complete control over labor, two things must be guaranteed. One, there must be an available pool of desperate workers to pull from. There needs to be that segment of people experiencing not only unemployment and the heavy mental burden that comes with it, but also dire need so that an otherwise unappealing job gets filled. Hence the reason capitalists are so staunchly against sensible welfare provisions. So long as people are desperate enough, capitalists can cycle them in and out of jobs that barely allow them to maintain an acceptable standard of living. Two, and intimately tied with the first point, firing workers must be as easy as possible. Having a mass of unemployed, ready-to-work people available helps, but so does knocking down the barriers put up by unionized labor and government regulations so the threat of unemployment becomes more tangible. Were this not the case, profits would not be maximized for the capitalist class and their version of efficiency, slowly pushing them out of the market in favor of their more ruthless competitors.
Why should you tap? Learn more below and take the free Washington Solar Home Survey. Great question.
The quest to maximize profit therefore naturally pushes people into unemployment and artificially creates a scarcity of jobs. In other words, in order for the system to work properly, there must always be a reserve army of labor, a section of the population unemployed and actively worse off. In theory, economists estimate this to be around 5% of the workforce, a percentage of people who are unemployed but only for a short time. In reality, unemployment is maintained at a much higher rate and includes far more people in both longer-term and more dire unemployment. Otherwise, hiring stops being quite so flexible and profitable for the owner class. This fact makes capitalism pretty unappealing. No society should only survive off the backs of underpaid workers and a steady flow of the desperately unemployed who face homelessness. But it doesn't end there. The profit motive and the overall organization of our economy pervert the notion of jobs entirely. Specifically, useful jobs are made unrewarding, while useless jobs become lucrative. This is David Graeber's thesis. Graeber was an anthropologist most well known for his 2018 book Bullshit Jobs. In this book, Graeber observes something we all know to be true. Some jobs exist solely to make the rich more money and to keep us working. Contrary to what we've long been told, that as technology improves, automation will ease our work week to fewer and fewer hours so we can more completely enjoy our lives away from the necessary labor required to maintain it, our capitalist society has tightened its grip on exploitation for exploitation's sake. Instead of phasing out human labor as more and more jobs become obsolete, allowing us to reap the benefits of an advanced economy where humans don't need to perform all essential labor, The quest for profit has created new jobs that serve entirely to boost numbers on a computer screen, accumulate the wealth and power of a greedy few, and keep the masses locked into jobs that alienate us and exhaust us too much to fight for meaningful change. Despite a decline in farming and industry jobs, we produce enough to cover far more basic needs and general goods than we could ever require. So where did the jobs go? According to Graeber, jobs became meaningless. In a complete reversal of capitalist theory, where jobs should disappear as they become unnecessary, useless jobs have become a fixture of our modern economy. We work for work's sake. The numbers are on Graeber's side. In a poll of the British workforce, a full 37% of those surveyed felt their jobs were meaningless, and an additional 13% didn't know if their jobs made any meaningful contribution to the world. That's 50% of jobs. Half of jobs are deemed by those who do them to be pointless. Paradoxically, these are often the white-collar, highly valued, and most lucrative jobs that fall into this unfulfilling dead end. These are not the essential workers spotlighted by the pandemic, whom we all saw are foundational to our survival. It's not the minimum wage workers who work meaningless jobs. Instead, a capitalist system that pursues growth for growth's sake and drags us along, forcing countless workers into aimless employment with the threat of starvation, creates a landscape of pointless labor that serves only to keep the machine running smoothly for the benefit of those at the controls. The masses work not for the common good, but to accrue financial capital for the disproportionately small ruling minority. If things were different, if we did cast off these pointless jobs that might as well not exist, our entire system would come undone. Homelessness, the 40-hour workweek, minimum wage jobs, none of it would be justifiable if we eliminated our attachment to the profit motive, the delusion of infinite growth, and the ridiculous idea that we all need to put more than half our waking hours into a job regardless of its necessity so that we can simply pay for our miserable existence. At this point, we should acknowledge that there is currently a labor shortage in minimum wage, particularly restaurant jobs. The reality of this situation, however, is not born out of any real shortage of people looking for a job, or the existence of too strong a social safety net, or a sudden lack of need for restaurants. People are realizing that when corporate lawyers make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year protecting multi-billion-dollar companies from the repercussions of their harmful cost-cutting, offering the bare minimum poverty wage of $7.25 an hour, not providing benefits or flexibility for an appropriate work-life balance, or even a safe work environment for a necessary job is not going to get people lining up to work for you. Ultimately, the combination of a job market that actively pushes people into unemployment or meaningless jobs, kicks wages down to the lowest possible rung, and makes it unprofitable to provide for the needy despite our ability and desire to do so, creates an infinite cycle of worsening conditions. A more thinly stretched economy justifies austerity measures for out-of-touch governments. It continues to concentrate wealth at the top, and it makes it even easier for a greater degree of exploitation to be forced upon the working masses. Here we get to the final piece of the puzzle, the regular destabilization of capitalism. Every few years, in recent decades about every 5 to 10 years on average, the entire economy crashes and enters a recession or depression. Huge portions of the population lose their jobs, the banks are bailed out, and after much suffering, mostly by the poor, things return to a new normal within a couple of years. Now just a little bit more fragile and a little bit more unequal. These crises, like the inaccurate rating of subprime mortgages in 2008 or the start of the pandemic in 2020, far from being the unexpected product of random happenings across the world, are a structural feature of a capitalist economy. And this is not a new idea. Non-capitalist economists anticipated the fragility of capitalism over 100 years ago. As Marx observed, and has been proven right time and time again as economic crises occur and continue to multiply, capitalism has a natural tendency to fall into crises as a result of what he called the falling rate of profit. Because capitalism naturally creates monopolies and the concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands, the rate of returns on investments continually falls. Over time, this problem balloons until investing money is less and less useful, stagnating an economy that needs to grow endlessly to survive, inevitably crashing it and dragging countless millions of human beings into precarity. Long-term sustainability is sacrificed at the cost of a fragile but functioning economy, liable to collapse at any moment. And when it does, it isn't capital that suffers, it's labor. regular people end up without a job and without a safety net. The point of this video is not that we should do what every president has promised since the beginning and create more jobs. As we've seen, more jobs don't always make things better if those jobs are pointless, alienating, dangerous, or demeaning. What we need is to better recognize the role jobs are meant to play and make them reflect that role more accurately. Jobs should not just be a way to make money, for ourselves or for the executives. Work, whether it's within the framework of a job or not, should be conducted with the express purpose of improving the human condition, at both the individual and societal level. This is clearly not what wage-based labor accomplishes.
I need that.
10 years ago, Oreo hit Kickstarter with the goal of making the outdoors more accessible to everyone.
Skip that.
Think of how many different things we could achieve if we committed our labor to our needs. We could improve our infrastructure in long-sighted and sustainable ways, build up our green energy capacity, increase the amount of available housing, focus on our local agriculture, make tangible, positive changes. These projects are rarely profitable, and that's why we don't see them today. Despite wage labor being at the center of a capitalist economy, it is neither natural nor eternal. And as we've seen, it makes people infinitely exploitable. It is not to be desired. Every socialist, at some point or another, has arrived or will arrive at this conclusion and argue that it is this unfair exchange, this contradiction between those who hire and those who sell their labor, that is at the core of our biggest societal challenges. Seen through this lens, work is not simply an economic practice, it is a political act. As people who want a better future, whether you consider yourself socialist yet or not, it is therefore our goal to politicize work in a more just way, whether that's through co-ops, unionization, or direct democratic control. Countless theories on work, compensation, and political economy have been devised by socialist thinkers over the years. But at the end of the day, the vision of labor that most settle on looks something like this. Work is an essential facet of life. However, it is far from being what life is about. The purpose of human life is not to toil endlessly. Living can be so much more. It is a myriad of things, from enjoying or creating art or good food, to forming meaningful relationships or bettering oneself. Work only facilitates that. And while labor can and should include some of these pleasures, fundamentally, work is only how we guarantee our ability to experience life. Under our current system, work doesn't have this role. It serves to generate profit, and since there is no natural cap to how much profit is desirable, neither is there a cap to how much work is deemed necessary. We are made to work more and more. The truth is that we can achieve all the necessary and even luxurious outcomes of work with far fewer hours, far fewer years of our lives, and far better conditions. The only reason that we don't is that a profit-based economy simply does not function that way. In a world of prosperity, we have been made to endlessly toil for the benefit of tyrants, for people we will never meet, and often whose names we do not even know. In order to build the future we deserve, we must dismantle the system that abuses work, this most fundamental of human endeavors. If you'd like to get a glimpse of what jobs could look like in the coming decades, I highly recommend you check out Work of the Future on CuriosityStream. It's a fascinating look at how technology can be used to help free humanity from menial labor and reinvigorate innovative and meaningful work. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As you probably know, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well. That's why some of my YouTuber friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. As educational creators ourselves, we love CuriosityStream, so we've worked out a deal, where if you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below, you'll also get access to Nebula, 100% free. That's less than $15 a year for both CuriosityStream and Nebula, which, in my humble opinion, is a pretty great deal. Since most of us are still waiting for the vaccine, why not spend some time learning about fascinating topics on CuriosityStream? Or check out Nebula's original content, including my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism. You can also watch all my videos as they were intended, ad-free. There really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content without the fear of demonetization. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Gotta eat and everything, so thank you guys so much for watching.